So in this video, I'm just going to talk about types and fonts and typography. And this can be a little tricky because it's really easy to ruin a cover with the wrong fonts or just the wrong layout. So I'm going to talk about where to find the best fonts and also some of the common mistakes you want to avoid to make a better book cover. I'm going to start with this site, Font, which has lots and lots of fonts, although one of the common limitations is that a lot of these fonts, on the one hand, they're not quite as professional, and that's because a lot of them are free, but they say free for personal use. So if you click on that, well, it'll tell you a little bit more. Some of these will say there's a suggested donation, but a lot of these are free for personal use, which just means they may not be free for professional use. And if you're in doubt, you probably shouldn't use them on your book cover. But it's a good place to start looking, even just because it has really simple categories. For a lot of covers like nonfiction or, like I've said, memoir or travel, maybe biography, a lot of covers are going to have simple fonts anyway, so you don't really want to be too creative. And if you can get away with simple design, then I would do so. I tend to over design. I'm always, I like pretty fonts and a lot of different stuff, but the covers that I see that I really like are just very simple and minimal. So it's okay to err on the side of simplicity. Generally, the bigger the design, the younger the audience. So for a young adult book, you might want to have fancier stuff, but for an older, more mature audience, you want to keep things really simple anyway. And when we're looking for fonts, we're mostly just looking for title font because the font is going to dictate the genre a little bit. So you don't want the genre to be unclear. You want people to see the cover and know exactly what genre it's in. So especially for some very heavy genres like maybe Western or sci-fi, you can look for like sci-fi fonts or fantasy. You want something a little fancier. Over here there's ancient, runes, elvish, a lot of different things. For post-apocalyptic or dystopian, you'd want a little bit more of a clean sci-fi. Post-apocalyptic, you'd want something a little distorted or eroded. But you want to be careful about going with something too cool or interesting that's a little bit hard to read. This would be a good example of a font that I think is really cool. It looks really good, but it's also a little hard to read. You might be better off with something a little cleaner. Although it's also true if you're selling online, people are going to see your title anyway right by the book cover. So it's more about the impression, the emotion, and communicating the genre, even if it's not like perfectly readable. The other kind of common mistake, a lot of people say the text needs to be legible as a thumbnail, but that mostly just means the title. Like I said earlier, if your author name is more important than the title, for example, Patricia Briggs is pretty famous, so she can get away with bigger author name and a really small title. Most books, same with Nora Roberts actually, but most books will have a larger title and a smaller author name. And you can see like some of the subtext here is really tiny. You don't want all of the text to be legible as a thumbnail, mostly the title and probably the author name. But like if the subtext is, even this J.K. Rowling is super famous, but her name is red against red and pretty small, it's not fighting for attention. There's a limitation with how much information you can communicate at the same time. So you want to start with the most important, biggest stuff, and then you work your way down to the smaller stuff, which is almost always going to be title first. The author name is at least half as small, although like this author name is probably an eighth of the size of the title because the title is really big. Even this one, Harry Potter, is probably 4 times bigger than the J.K. Rowling. You don't want all the elements fighting for attention. And then the subtext, like million best-selling copy author or the Sorcerer's Stone even, is smaller than both the title and the author name. So part of it is just the balance, not having everything the same size. It's okay to have much smaller text, but also the title is in a more of a fancy font, a genre-specific font, and everything else, the author name, is much smaller, either a serif or sans serif, but just really simple and easy to read. So you don't want, for example, you don't want your author name in the same fancy font that you used for the title. You only want the one fancy font on the title. I was going to look for fantasy also. Fantasy is a little tricky because you're really looking for decorative serif fonts, and there's some really good ones, but like they don't really show up in these categories well. They don't have a fantasy specific category. I would just look under serif, and you're looking for something that's kind of pretty, maybe with some nice tails. And you can even type your title up here in preview, and it'll show you what your title is going to look like. Um, However, as I said, this is really just a site to get started with. A lot of these are free for personal use, but may not be okay for book cover design. So I would look for something to use on other sites as well. So the other site I like a lot is Creative Market. Creative Market has a lot of more fancy designer fonts, and these may be too fancy for a lot of different um, stuff, but you can look for sans serif script display. I wouldn't use a script in most book covers except potentially something like romance. But if I just go to their serif fonts, you can see they have some really pretty decorative um, fonts. Something like this, for example, this is a font that's beautiful, it looks amazing, but it's probably too complicated for book cover design. Unless it's really pulled off well, it's probably going to be a little hard to read and complicated. So this is a font that's $39, so you can see that these are more expensive than some other choices. And it can be a mistake to get something too distinctive if it's there's a handful of fonts that are used for like every fantasy or urban fantasy book cover just because they're so pretty and clean. Um, and on the one hand, it's you don't want to do the same thing that everybody else is doing. On the other hand, it's an easy win because you know it's going to look good and you know it's going to be really obvious and clear what the genre is. So I wouldn't necessarily avoid it and try to do something more distinctive either. These fonts are really meant for graphic design, so they're not all perfect for book cover design. And like I said, some of them are a little bit too fancy and decorative, so I'd want to be careful, even if you use one, not to use like all of the flourishes and embellishments. Another site that's pretty good is My Fonts. My Fonts has a little bit of everything, and it's a little more expensive because generally they give you the option of getting an entire package. They also have a pretty cool tool called What the Font, where in theory you could upload, like if you found another book cover or something that had a font that you liked, you could upload a picture and it would identify the font for you. It only really works if it's a simple text on like a flat background. If it's on a book cover or something with art behind it, it probably won't do a great job of identifying the font. But if I did find something I like, for example, here's one that's kind of interesting for something like fantasy. Then it'll show me I could get kind of a package of all the different font styles for 120, which is kind of a lot. But actually for the cover, if I'm just using it for the title, basically, I probably don't need, medium and italic and everything. I could just choose one. It'd be 25 bucks. Another site that's pretty good is Graphic River. They actually have a program called Envato Elements, and so for $16.50 a month, you get access to a whole bunch of stuff. And so for the price, for $16.50 a month, you could sign up and download all the fonts that you want, and then just cancel after a month. It's a pretty good deal because they've got quite a good selection. I mean, a lot of these aren't great for book cover design, but there are a few. There's probably 5 or 10 in here that I would use pretty easily for sci-fi or fantasy or something. There's a lot of other like cool creative fonts that wouldn't really work for a book cover, but depending on what you need, you may find something that really works for you. So a couple more quick comments on fonts. One mistake I see a lot is that authors try to do their author branding with the font, which means they have one fancy font that they use for their author name, and then they try to replicate that across all their books. That doesn't really work. It can be okay for a series, but your branding is more than the font that you use for your author name. And actually, the author name really isn't the most important part of a book cover. It's not like you always want your cover to sell your book to strangers, because if they already know you and recognize your author name, they're going to be less influenced by the book cover design. So that kind of branding doesn't even matter, especially if it puts off new readers because it doesn't look as professional. You always want to focus more on being as like lowering the bar to entry for new readers. If it looks a little weird or unusual or unprofessional, um, it's easier for strangers to bail faster. So you want to try to make your book cover look as professional as possible. Your author name is going to be a simple serif or sans serif font. You want to make sure it's a really well balanced cover, which means like the title is the biggest and the author name is half the size and the subtext is a quarter of the size, just so that it's not all competing for attention or the same size. You don't want different fancy fonts contrasting with each other. So that's why we have one really simple or simple serif or sans serif font, and then a little bit fancier title font. And then you want to space out all the elements so that not only are the different lines evenly spaced between, like if you break the title into a few different words, or even between the title and the subtitle and the picture, just having kind of about an equal spacing between the different elements, and also an equal spacing between the letters. Some fonts you can't really, like if it's a script font where it's all connected, you can't space it out. But in most cases, for most text on your book cover, you really want to increase the kerning so there's more spacing between the letters. Smaller letters with more spacing will look more professional than bigger letters that are all crammed together. And finally, I haven't really talked about text effects yet, but generally want to steer clear of them. In Microsoft Word, there's not a lot of options anyway to do text effects, but generally unprofessional designers will use text effects as a way to get the text to stand out against the background, which isn't really what you want. Your text should look a little flatter anyway. Bevels and that 3D typography text effects was really cool 10 years ago. Now design looks a lot more professional when it's just flat and a simple color. You can see all of these are kind of flat design. This one has a little bit of a gradient, maybe a little bit of a texture, but as long as the font is a different color from the background text, it should stand out pretty well already. And sometimes you need to make the background art one color or a little bit darker. You can sometimes use a very light drop shadow effect to add some shadow behind the text, but I'd be careful about using a 3D effect or a bevel effect because it just can look unprofessional if it's not done very well. Just to kind of point this out, I'm on Amazon where I just want to click over to a few different fantasy covers. So here's one, for example. There's a very light text effect behind it, but it's mostly gray. I actually would have made this a little bit lighter so it stands out. And he breaks my rule of using the fancy font for the author names instead of the title, but I like how the title is really simple and clear to read. Here's one of my books where I tried to have a little bit of a kind of 3D effect where you have like the sword is sticking through the letters. There's a way sometimes where you can have the typography blend in with the art a little bit so that the art is coming out in front of the typography. It's a little tricky to do. It's easier in Photoshop. My point is that I just use kind of a flat font. This is actually too fancy of a font. I prefer the covers where it's just a simple serif font anyway. And then you'll see some with a little bit of like a glow effect or color effect, or some where maybe one word is a different color. This one actually has a tiny bit of a bevel, like a 3D effect, and a pretty heavy drop shadow, which looks okay on this cover. It does make it stand out a lot to have that drop shadow there. And then here's an example of one with a much heavier bevel and also a pattern overlay. So this is the type of stuff what you couldn't do in Microsoft Word. You could do it in Photoshop. It's not that difficult to do, but and like it looks fine as long as the text effects kind of blend in with the rest of the art altogether. It looks really good and is pretty strong, but often people get carried away with text effects and they throw on a bunch of cool stuff and it stands out not in a good way from the background art. It doesn't look like one cover or one piece. And here's another one with a heavier metallic kind of bevel, and also pretty heavy drop shadow, but you almost can't tell because there's already, you can tell with a lot of professionally designed covers, there's one or two main background colors. So this is just basically bluish teal with red on the bottom, which makes the text, like the text can stand out a little better because it's not fighting for it's not fighting against a complex background with a lot of different elements or colors going on. This is basically all faded out so that you can really see the text clearly, which is why it can work. It's difficult to say like never use bevel or drop shadow because of course it can work, but if you try to use it, I won't have an example of an unprofessional cover, but if you throw on bevel and drop shadow and the background is still really busy or messy, or it's not enough for the text to stand out, it just makes it harder to read. So if you're not already doing the background well enough or making it really dark or making it like a flat one color layer, then it's going to be safer just to stick with flat text anyway, because your flat text is going to look cleaner and stand out better.